This is Toby Capwell, historian, author, and expert on medieval and Renaissance arms and armor. Today, as we gear up for the release of Shadow of the Erdtree, he's joining us to break down some of the armor in Elden Ring.
The fact that they have realized the connection between full plate armor of the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries in Europe and prosthetic limbs. That's a real thing.
If you enjoy this kind of content, be sure to check out our previous episodes and subscribe for more experts breaking down your favorite games coming very soon. But without further ado, it's over to Toby.
So here we have a fantastical warrior figure who is heavily referring to Scandinavian warriors of the early medieval period. The 5th, 6th century, early Vikings, Vendel, Valsgard culture in Sweden. Also a culture that's very closely connected with the early Anglo-Saxons in the British Isles, as represented by the excavations at Sutton Hoo and Rendlesham Forest and places like that. Easily recognizable, the references that they're using. Very nice textile textures. The fantasy elements are quite subtle. I mean, they're really engaging very much with the real look of the early Viking cultures, if you want to call them that. Especially the design of the helmets, where you have a close-fitting skull that has this kind of decorative framework of copper alloy, and then it has decorative plates inserted and riveted onto it, along with the decorated nose guard and eyes. That's very, very distinctive of this period, and really nicely rendered here. This Golden Knight actually brings up, I think, a really important kind of reoccurring issue in video game design generally these days. And that has to do with the amount of decoration that they're putting on the armored surfaces, the amount of engraving or etching or embossing or whatever decorative technique is intended. I mean, this guy, not only is he fully gilded, where the presumably steel armor is covered in gold, he's also got a lot of figurative decorative surface decoration on there. And you can understand how tempting it is to create a figure like that, because you've got incredible processing power on systems now, and the resolution is really high, and people are looking at these images deeply and intensely. So you can see that there's the pressure to really pack as much detail and decoration into the available surface area as you possibly can. But I would just say to designers thinking about doing images like this that it's worth considering stepping back a bit from the decoration. It's not to say it's wrong. The 15th and 16th centuries, there were full-plate armors that were fully gilded and fully etched, the armors of kings and princes and emperors, but it's pretty rare. And a lot of the real beauty of real armor comes not from surface decoration, but from the pure sculptural form. Of course, a designer wants to come up with something that's really definitive and iconic. And so the figurative decoration, dragons and foliage and everything else makes sense from that point of view. But the pure sculptural form can have an identity as well. It can be really iconic without actually any surface decoration at all. Well, there's not a lot of armor happening here except on the head, and I suppose if you're going to wear one piece of armor, a helmet is a good idea. The bars and the overall kind of impression of this character is vaguely something like a Roman gladiator, although very much elaborated with the designer's imagination. The hooded fur coat is not something I've seen before on a gladiator. And indeed, warriors of the Bronze Age often did fight largely naked, but they did prioritize leg armor on their lower legs when they didn't necessarily have it very much anywhere else. But that was usually because they had huge shields. We mustn't forget about the role that the shield plays in determining what someone wears on their body. I would never expect to see someone dressed like this without a really big shield, in reality. I mean, I see that they're going for a visual impression here. The rendering of the bars on the helmet is actually very specifically taken from club tournament helmets of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, but they've taken that construction which they like, of these thin vertical bars with horizontal round bars going through them, and wedded that onto something that refers more to armor of the ancient world. So for a lot of people, this is, very much a recognizable medieval knight. But to me, it is a patchwork of different periods and a bit strange looking. The image of a chivalric warrior of the Middle Ages in Europe, but very much a designer's idea, taking elements that they find to be interesting or eye-catching and then slamming them together to try and create something new and memorable. It's really important to think about games like this as kind of visual works of art, interactive visual works of art. It's no good trying to hold them to account from a real point of view or a practical point of view, because that's not what they're trying to do. They're not trying to simulate reality at all. This is a powerful visual image that's fun to play and memorable, and images that stick in your head. The designer is thinking, okay, what says knight to me? What are all of the crazy iconic aspects that I can put together? And so they've combined things from a number of different periods in the effort to do that. The distinctive qualities of a knight's equipment change decade by decade and century by century. The head is protected by a great helm, probably the most iconic medieval knightly form of head protection. But that dates from like the middle of the 13th century. But then he also has, comprehensive coverage over the rest of his body with articulated plates, plate armor, but of the late 15th or 16th century, more or less. And then just for fun, they've added a pair of Polish winged hussar wings that date from the medieval revival in Poland in the 17th century. So they're not trying to hit any specific period. That's not what they're trying to do, so there's no point in judging them on that basis. I think this is interesting just to see what historical elements make an impression to a modern digital artist, a modern designer. What historical details make an impression? This is just looking at the lower body and the leg defenses of this character. The fact that you have plate defenses on the knees and the lower legs, but there's nothing on the upper legs, and that's combined with long skirts on some kind of coat or garment worn over the top. I think what we're seeing here is an influence of film and television armor influencing video games. This particular arrangement of leg armor and sort of skirts protecting the hips and the upper legs is something you see all the time in film and TV, in the Lord of the Rings films, in Game of Thrones. They all do this because of the limitations of the materials that they're using. They usually make their plate armor out of polyurethane, which is great for certain things and not so good for other things. One of the things that's really difficult to do, if not impossible, is to create a really reliable working joint out of polyurethane in the same way that you would make it out of very thin but strong steel. Making full articulated leg armor with a plate for the upper leg and a correct knee joint is very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve at the level of practicality that they need for filming. So leaving the upper legs uncovered and then just putting a big skirt on. It's a very common design solution in film and TV. Then game designers see Lord of the Rings, they see Game of Thrones. That becomes part of their image of what this stuff looks like. What's cool, the skirts are cool, it's an opportunity for color and texture, and we move on. But we don't have proper leg armor. In contrast to the upper body, where things like breastplates and arm defenses and shoulder plates are very relatively straightforward to make out of polyurethane. I think game designers really need to seize the capabilities of their medium and break away from the restrictions of real world costume designers. They could be doing really different things. It's just that they're probably not always aware of where their own inspirations are coming from. Everybody has preconceptions. We don't always know what the origin of those ideas actually are. Obviously, we're not dealing with a human armor user here, so the design of the armor has to accommodate the werewolf or whatever this is. But there does seem to be an attempt here about thinking about, again, what would plate armor, how would it have to be built for a non-human user. That's kind of interesting to see what they were trying to work out with that. Lots of articulation, obviously. The laminated articulation of the joints is also a very eye-catching visual effect as well, and can be used either to suggest a practical consideration or just a cool visual impression. This is really interesting because it seems very obvious that the designers are aiming for a kind of Spanish impression, or at least an Iberian aesthetic. Very much of that part of the world. The wide-brimmed helmet, the cup-hilt rapier with this really long stabbing blade, sort of quintessentially Spanish, Portuguese, Southern Italian. Rapiers like that wouldn't be wearing plate armor, but they're looking for an amusing character who has armor but also clearly has a really pronounced kind of stabbing, thrusting method of fighting. And that's all very evocative of Spain in a way. And the kind of physical characteristics, it kind of evokes a kind of Sancho Panza character. Armor always will accentuate the nature of the body underneath. Armor has a way of absorbing the identity of the wearer. And I think they're kind of playing on that here in an extreme way, that this is some kind of portly little dwarf character, and he's got this really kind of globose breastplate. He almost looks like a kind of armored potato bug or something. I think that's very much what they're trying to do. But that shows that they understand that armor is expressive art as well as technical equipment for fighting, that it can express character. They've nailed that. I love the texture on the armor, that kind of black hammer finish surface. A lot of armor that had to be kept at a low level of expense. Armor that had to be made cheaply for mass production and mass purchase. 2,000 armors for infantry at a time. Armorers found all kinds of clever ways of lowering the cost of their work, and one of the best ways to do that is to not polish it. Armor doesn't need to be shiny to protect you. You can take it right out of the forge, stick some straps on it, and off you go. And that's what they're showing here. The sort of construction is a bit fantastical, but I really love that they've thought about the basic texture of the metal. He's not plastered in floral decoration, but the texture really does that job. It's really, really nice. The kind of rusty, blackened, scratched, real armor looks like that. With his method of fighting, a very, very efficient stabbing method of fighting, he shouldn't have to jump around that much. He should be able to just use his armor to take any incoming blow while he stabs his opponent through the head or whatever. The fantasy element is again combining that kind of unarmored dueling combat with an armored figure. But certainly those very, very long, very stiff rapiers of the early 17th century, it's a formidable weapon, and it undoubtedly could do exactly what they show it doing. The design of this character is clearly meant to be a contrast to the more heavily armored figures. He's meant to be faster, lighter on his feet, more maneuverable perhaps, but he still has to have some protection. Here there's very little reference to anything real or historical. This is much more of something deriving from modern design tropes of various kinds. Throwing knives and this whole idea of having some kind of asymmetrical defense on one shoulder that's then strapped across the body. You see that all over the place all the time. And I don't know where it comes from, but it's a departure from reality generally, although it's very popular in game design. The sword belt's nice. Not to depart from armor there, but the sword belt is a nice reference to a real braided sword belt and scabbard of the 13th century. Perfectly respectable medieval sword there too. But as far as the separate leather forearm defenses and elbow defenses, this is much more of a modern idea of armor rather than anything real. This is still a fantasy, but it's a Japanese flavored fantasy. And actually the technical makeup of the way the plates are put together, the way the cords are knotted, the nature of the leg defenses, this is all much more like real Japanese armor than the European stuff we've just seen resembles real European equipment. So I would infer that the designers here are Japanese, and what we're seeing here is a greater familiarity with the historical arms and armor of their own country. Any designer has to work with what they already know and what is most familiar to them. Some of the fluting and some of the subtleties, the way those plates are put together and the way they're decorated is kind of fantastical. But overall, this is obviously very recognizable as a Japanese armor. This character is, for me, one of the most interesting things we've seen so far in this game. The fact that they have realized the connection between full plate armor of the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries in Europe and prosthetic limbs. That's a real thing. When I was curator of the museum in Glasgow, the armor collection included several late 16th and early 17th century prostheses that were in the collection because they were made out of recycled armor. And it makes total sense. The plates of the armor are already the shape of the limb that you need. It's not a complicated operation, really, to turn something like an arm defense into a prosthetic arm. And if you look through medical collections, at the Wellcome collection here in London, or really anywhere you care to look, you will find historical prosthesis made out of old armor. And there are also characters in history that relate to exactly this. Foremost, and you need mention almost nobody else in this context, is Götz von Berlichingen, or Götz of the Iron Hand, who was a German nobleman in the early 16th century. When he was a young man besieging the city of Landshut in Bavaria, someone fired a large caliber handgun at him, and it hit the sword that he was wearing as he was on his horse with his spear. And the sword shattered, and the shattering hilt, the guard of the sword, severed his forearm. Just shattered his forearm, hand gone. And ever after suffering that injury, he wore a prosthetic hand, supposedly that an armorer had made him so that it had some kind of gripping action, and it could be made to grip his sword and to allow him to continue his profession. So this character here seems about as far out and bizarre as you might think, but it's actually one of the most interesting historical references that we've seen so far. Well, theoretically, a pot might make a serviceable helmet.
This is Let Me Solo Her, an individual in the Elden Ring community who specializes in beating this boss in particular.
Huh.
Wearing nothing but a pot and pants.
He must have some kind of extrasensory perception, because fighting blind, no matter what martial arts movies tell you is not really a thing. There is a long and august history of satirical warrior characters of one sort or another wearing pots and pans as helmets. It goes way back, and it continues as a theme in satirical cartoons from the 18th century really to the present day. I mean, you see it in real historical art too. And, you look at paintings of Hieronymus Bosch or Bruegel or any of those kind of proto-surreal artists. You'll always find people wearing pots on their heads somewhere. So this is an ancient and hallowed tradition.
Your strength, extraordinary.
Overall, with Elden Ring, I very much like and appreciate the amount of interaction that the designers have had with real historical sources from different periods in history and in different regions throughout the world. They've clearly done their homework, and they've used all of those diverse cultural and historical references to create something original that has obviously made an impact in gaming world and gaming culture. But as good as they are, they couldn't have done that off the top of their head. They needed to do the homework and get those sources of inspiration flowing. And that's how this works. All great artists throughout history, whether you're a sculptor or Leonardo da Vinci or whoever, they all had sources of inspiration that have come before them. That's how you create great art. And I think, judging this game as visual art against its contemporaries, it really distinguishes itself for that reason.
Thank you so much for watching. Remember to comment below other games you'd like to see on the show, and be sure to subscribe for more content like this and beyond.